The harbour at dawn smelled of brine and ink, of wet rope and the mineral tang of silver coins counted in darkness. Genoa rose from the Ligurian coast, not in the manner of Rome's triumphant columns or Venice's gilded basilicas, but as a fortress carved from necessity, a city of narrow streets that climbed steep hillsides like the ribs of some ancient creature, its bones made of Carrara marble, and its blood the ceaseless flow of capital. Here, in the creaking counting houses that lined the Via degli Orefici, men in black wool robes sat hunched over ledgers bound in Moroccan leather, their fingers stained with the residue of commerce, calculating interest rates with the precision of astronomers charting the movements of distant stars. The Genoese did not build temples to their wealth, they built ledgers. By the dawn of the 15th century, while other Italian city-states measured their greatness in the expanse of conquered territory or the magnificence of their cathedrals, Genoa had learned a darker, more patient mathematics. The Grimaldi, the Spinola, the Doria, these names carried no crowns, commanded no vast armies that could be paraded through streets in triumph, yet they possessed something far more insidious. They held the invisible chains of debt that bound kings to their thrones. In the shadowed halls of their family palazzos, where the air hung thick with the scent of beeswax candles and old parchment, these merchant princes understood what the great conquerors of their age did not. That power, true power, flows not from the sword, but from the ledger, not from the throne, but from the counting house, not from the declaration of war, but from the quiet extension of credit that makes war possible. Genoa itself was a paradox carved in stone. It possessed neither the fertile hinterlands of Milan nor the lagoon-protected majesty of Venice. Its territory was compressed, a thin strip of rocky coast, where the Apennine Mountains seemed to shoulder their way into the Mediterranean, leaving little room for agriculture, less for expansion. This geographical constraint became, in the cruel alchemy of necessity, the city's greatest asset. Unable to feed themselves from their own soil, unable to expand inland against the fortified positions of their neighbours, the Genoese turned their eyes outward, toward the grey-green expanse of the sea. But they did not turn to it as conquerors. They turned to it as accountants. The great insight of Genoa, the revelation that would reshape the hidden architecture of European power, was this: the ship is mightier than the mine. While the Spanish would exhaust themselves extracting silver from the mountains of Potosi, while the Portuguese would plant their flags on distant shores and claim dominion over spice routes, the Genoese understood that the man who owns the ship that carries the silver, who charges the freight, who extends the credit for the voyage, who insures the cargo against loss, this man takes his percentage without ever descending into the mine shaft, without ever risking the fever dreams of tropical conquest. The Genoese built an empire of percentages, and percentages, unlike territories, require no garrisons to defend them. Walk through the Genoa of 1450, and you would find a city that seemed almost austere by the standards of its rivals. No Doge's palace dripping with Byzantine gold. No Medici gardens where philosophers debated the revival of Platonic ideals. Instead, you would find the Banco di San Giorgio, a building of such severe grey stone that it appeared less constructed than excavated, as if the institution had always existed beneath the city and had merely been revealed by the careful removal of unnecessary earth. The bank's facade bore no ornament save for the red cross of St. George, that ancient symbol of crusading faith now repurposed as a guarantee of solvency. Inside, in rooms lit by narrow windows that let in slices of harsh Mediterranean light, clerks worked in near silence, their quills scratching against paper in a rhythm as steady as the tide. The Banco di San Giorgio was not simply a bank. To call it merely a financial institution would be to mistake the ocean for a large pond. Chartered in 1407, it emerged from a consolidation of Genoa's chaotic public debts, the compere as they were called, scattered obligations to various creditor groups that threatened to tear the republic apart through competing claims. The solution was radical in its simplicity: merge all debts, all creditors, into a single institution, and then grant that institution powers that would make a king weep with envy. The Banco di San Giorgio could levy its own taxes. It could mint its own coins. It could raise its own armies. It could, and did, govern entire territories, Corsica, the eastern settlements along the Black Sea, not as colonies of Genoa, but as possessions of the bank itself, run not by governors but by accountants, not for glory, but for the systematic extraction of revenue to service the bonds held by the bank's shareholders. Here was the future, written in double-entry bookkeeping, a state within a state, a government run as a joint stock company, a republic where voting rights were determined not by birth or military valor, but by how many shares of the public debt you held. The Banco di San Giorgio was the world's first true technocracy, a machine designed to transform political power into financial returns with a ruthless efficiency that anticipated by centuries the mechanisms that would come to dominate global capital. Machiavelli himself, visiting Genoa decades later, would observe with something approaching awe that the Banco held more loyalty from Genoese citizens than the Republic itself. Because while governments rose and fell, while factions murdered each other in the streets, the bank paid its dividends with clockwork precision. The great families understood this transformation in power's nature with an instinct that ran deeper than theory. The Grimaldi had begun as mercenaries and pirates, men who took what they wanted at sword point. But by the 15th century, a Grimaldi sitting in his palazzo in the Piazza San Matteo was more likely to have ink-stained fingers than calluses from sword grips. The transition was complete and irreversible. Violence had become too expensive, too uncertain, too crude. Far better to own the debt of the man who commands the soldiers than to command the soldiers yourself. The condottieri, those magnificent mercenary captains who dominated Italian warfare, were themselves often deep in debt to Genoese bankers, which meant that the banker, sitting in his counting house 300 miles from the battlefield, could determine the outcome of wars without ever drawing a sword. The Spinola understood this perhaps better than anyone. Their fortune had been built on alum, that mineral essential for fixing dyes in cloth, making it indispensable to the textile industries that clothed all of Europe. But the Spinola did not merely mine and trade alum, they financed the mining operations, controlled the shipping, extended credit to the textile manufacturers who bought the product, and then, in a final twist of financial architecture, they lent money to the very kings and princes whose courts demanded the finest dyed fabrics. The circle was complete. Every transaction, from the mine shaft to the royal wardrobe, passed through Spinola hands, and at each passage a percentage remained behind, accumulating in accounts that were never fully audited, never fully visible, recorded in ledgers that were themselves locked away in vaults beneath vaults. The Doria achieved something even more audacious. They made themselves indispensable to everyone while remaining loyal to no one. Andrea Doria, the great admiral who would later become the liberator of Genoa from French occupation, began his career as a mercenary admiral for hire, serving Francis I of France with the same cool professionalism with which he would later serve Charles V of Spain. The Doria family palazzo, rebuilt in the 16th century into a structure of such austere magnificence that it seemed carved from a single block of marble, embodied this philosophy. Its facade was impenetrable, revealing nothing. Its gardens were hidden behind walls. Its treasures were invisible from the street. The message was clear: we are here, we are powerful, but we will not explain ourselves to you. This was the philosophy of the super-neutral banker, elevated to the status of civic religion. Genoa, despite its factional violence, despite the endless struggles between Guelph and Ghibelline, between noble and popolari, maintained a singular external posture. Absolute flexibility of alliance combined with absolute reliability of contract. The Genoese would lend to anyone, Catholic or Protestant, French or Spanish, Sultan or Pope, but once the terms were set, once the contract was sealed with signatures and wax, the obligations became as immutable as the stars. To default on a Genoese loan was not merely to court financial ruin, but to be excommunicated from the invisible church of credit, to be marked as unreliable in ledgers that were consulted from London to Constantinople, to be shut out of the vast web of information and capital that made modern statecraft possible. For this was Genoa's other great strength, less visible than its ships, but equally potent: information. The Genoese merchant networks stretched across the known world, from the trading posts of the Black Sea to the markets of Seville, from the money changers of Antwerp to the spice warehouses of Lisbon. Every Genoese agent was not merely a trader, but an intelligence gatherer, sending back reports on harvests and plagues, on troop movements and royal bankruptcies, on mines newly discovered and trade routes newly blocked. These reports arrived in Genoa in a steady stream, carried by fast galleys that made the voyage from Spain to Italy in days rather than weeks, and they were analyzed with the same systematic attention that astronomers applied to celestial observations. The Genoese knew about a crisis in Castilian finances before the Castilian court did. They knew when the Ottoman Sultan was planning a new campaign, before Venice's famous intelligence service had confirmed the rumors. This informational advantage allowed them to move capital with perfect timing, extending credit when others were withdrawing it, buying assets when others were panic selling, and always taking their percentage. The counting houses where this information was processed and this capital was allocated were themselves remarkable spaces. Built of stone so thick that they could withstand a siege, fitted with doors of bronze and iron, secured with locks whose mechanisms were known only to a handful of master craftsmen, these buildings were fortresses more secure than any castello. Inside, the atmosphere was cathedral quiet, but entirely lacking in spirituality. The walls were bare of decoration, the better to focus the mind on numbers. The desks were arranged not for conversation, but for concentration, each clerk positioned beneath a window that provided precisely enough light to see the ledger without glare. The smell was distinctive: old paper and fresh ink, the mineral scent of coins recently counted, the faint aroma of sealing wax, and underneath it all, something else, the smell of cold stone never quite warmed by any fire, as if the building itself were keeping its secrets cool and preserved. Here, men worked who understood that they were engaged in a form of warfare more sophisticated than anything practiced on the battlefields of Italy. They calculated compound interest the way artillery officers calculated trajectories. They analyzed the creditworthiness of monarchs with the cold precision of physicians examining a patient's urine. They created financial instruments, bills of exchange, letters of credit, partnerships of staggering complexity that allowed money to move across Europe without physical gold or silver ever changing hands, thereby avoiding both the risk of robbery and the attention of tax collectors. These instruments were the secret weapons of Genoese power, and like all effective weapons, they were designed to be invisible to their targets. The relationship between Genoa and the Spanish crown, that would come to dominate the 16th century was not born from any natural alliance or shared ideology. Spain and Genoa had no historical friendship, no dynastic marriages binding their ruling houses, no common cause beyond the brutal pragmatism of mutual need. The Spanish Habsburgs required something that their vast American empire could not provide: liquid capital, available immediately, in large quantities, in the right places at the right times. Silver flowed from the New World in spectacular quantities, but it flowed irregularly, arriving in great flotillas that were vulnerable to storms, pirates, and the simple chaos of distance. Moreover, the silver arrived in Seville, but Spanish armies fought in Flanders, in Italy, in Germany. Moving physical bullion across hostile territory was dangerous and slow. What Spain needed was a financial infrastructure that could anticipate needs, that could extend credit in Antwerp based on silver that had not yet left Peru, that could pay German mercenaries in currency they trusted, that could, in effect, turn the uncertain promise of future wealth into present power. The Genoese, and only the Genoese, could provide this service. They had the ships to carry the silver safely. They had the agents in every major port to handle transfers. They had the credit networks to extend loans across the continent. Most importantly, they had the cold nerve to lend vast sums to a monarchy that was, by any rational accounting, constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. The Spanish crown declared formal default multiple times during the 16th century: 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, and each time the Genoese banks would negotiate a restructuring, accepting new terms, extending new credit, because they understood something that outside observers missed. A default is only catastrophic if you have no choice but to accept it. But if you are the only source of credit available, if the king cannot fight his wars without your money, then a default becomes merely a negotiation, and the terms of the new loan can be adjusted to recoup what was lost in the old one. This was the invisible lender at work, not invisible in the sense of hidden, but invisible in the sense of operating through mechanisms that were incomprehensible to those who thought of power in traditional terms. The Spanish king sat on a throne of gold extracted from continents he claimed to own. But he could not pay his soldiers without Genoese credit. He could not move his armies without Genoese ships. He could not fund his wars without Genoese bankers who had calculated, with ruthless precision, exactly how much debt the crown could service from its revenues, and who lent precisely up to that line and not a ducat beyond. The King of Spain commanded millions of subjects, but when he needed money for his campaigns, he sat in his palace and waited for Genoese bankers to arrive with terms, and those terms were not negotiable. The atmosphere of these negotiations was distinctive. They did not take place in throne rooms, where the majesty of kingship might intimidate. They took place in private chambers, often in the evening, with only a few trusted advisers present. The Genoese banker, perhaps a Spinola, perhaps a Grimaldi, would arrive dressed in black, carrying only a leather satchel containing papers. No ceremony, no deference beyond what courtesy required. The terms would be presented clearly, without embellishment. The interest rate, usually between 12 and 15%, though during moments of extreme need, it could rise much higher. The collateral, specific tax revenues, perhaps the Silver Fleet, perhaps customs duties from the Netherlands. The consequences of default, spelled out with the same precision as the terms of payment. The king could accept or refuse, but both parties understood that refusal meant the campaign would not happen, the soldiers would not be paid, the empire would contract. So the king accepted, and the banker departed, and somewhere in a counting house in Genoa, a clerk would make an entry in a ledger, and the empire would continue, powered not by Spanish will, but by Genoese capital. This was the world that the Genoese had created by the early 16th century, a financial architecture so sophisticated, so necessary, so embedded in the functioning of European power that it had become invisible to those who relied upon it. Ships sailed, armies marched, palaces were built, wars were won and lost, and at every stage, Genoese capital made it possible, Genoese logistics made it efficient, and Genoese percentages made it profitable for Genoa. The city itself remained relatively small, relatively weak in military terms, its internal politics often chaotic, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the Banco di San Giorgio and its branches, the counting houses and their ledgers, the ships and their cargoes, the agents and their networks, the credit and its invisible reach. The Asiento was not a contract in any conventional sense. It was closer to a sacrament, a binding of souls through numbers, an arrangement so intimate and so total that it transformed the relationship between sovereign and banker into something that resembled marriage more than commerce. The word itself, asiento, meant simply seat or agreement, a term of such deliberate blandness that it concealed the revolutionary nature of what it represented. Through the asiento, the Genoese bankers did not merely lend money to the Spanish crown. They became the crown's treasury, its monetary system, its financial nervous system. They stood between the king and his ability to act in the world, and in that position, invisible to the crowds that cheered Spanish triumphs, they wielded a power that no amount of military force could challenge. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity, diabolical in its implications. Philip II, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, Duke of Milan, King of Naples and Sicily, master of an empire upon which the sun never set, required money constantly and in quantities that defied the capacity of any medieval fiscal system to provide. His wars in Flanders alone consumed silver faster than the mines of Potosi could produce it. His Mediterranean galleys, necessary to check Ottoman expansion, required not just construction but constant maintenance, crews, provisions, and the infinite small expenses that turned naval power from a theoretical asset into an operational reality. His court, vast and ceremonial, demanded the constant display of magnificence that legitimized his rule. His bureaucracy, sprawling across continents, required salaries paid promptly or face collapse into corruption and paralysis. But the silver that made all this possible arrived irregularly, in great fleets that sailed once or twice a year from Seville, vulnerable to Atlantic storms, to English pirates, to simple misfortune, and even when the silver arrived safely, it arrived in the wrong place. Spanish armies fought in Flanders, in Italy, in Germany, in North Africa. Moving physical bullion from Seville to these theatres of war was not merely difficult but often impossible. The overland routes passed through hostile territory, the sea routes invited interception, and the sheer logistics of transporting tons of silver in an age when 100 miles might take a week to traverse made the entire enterprise a nightmare of coordination. The Genoese solution was to eliminate distance itself, or rather, to make distance irrelevant through the alchemy of credit. An asiento worked as follows. Philip II would promise to deliver a certain quantity of silver to Genoese bankers in Seville when the fleet arrived, let us say 1 million ducats. In exchange, the Genoese would provide that same sum, minus their fee, immediately, in whatever location Philip required. If Spanish armies in Flanders needed payment, Genoese agents in Antwerp would provide the funds, drawn against the credit of silver that had not yet left Peru, that might not yet have been extracted from the mountain, that existed at the moment of the contract only as potential, as promise, as the king's word secured against the future productivity of an empire. The percentages varied depending on the urgency of need and the perceived risk, but they were never small. A typical asiento might charge 15 to 20% for this service, a rate that would scandalize modern sensibilities, but that represented, in the cold calculus of 16th century power, an absolute bargain. What the Genoese provided was not merely money, but time itself. They collapsed the months or years between need and payment into the instant of the contract's signing. They turned future wealth into present power. And for this service, this manipulation of time through credit, they extracted their tribute, their percentage, their share of an empire they had never conquered. Walk into a counting house in Genoa during the height of Philip II's reign, let us say the year 1570, when the Spanish fleet had just won its great victory at Lepanto, but the king's treasury faced imminent collapse. And you would witness a scene of activity that seemed, superficially, calm. Clerks sat at their desks, writing carefully in ledgers. Messengers arrived and departed with sealed packets of correspondence. Senior partners conferred in low voices in private rooms. But beneath this appearance of routine business, a drama of world historical significance was unfolding. The papers, being so carefully notarized, represented promises from the most powerful monarch in Christendom. The figures, being so meticulously recorded, determined whether Spanish armies would eat, whether they would fight, whether the empire would hold or fracture. These men in their black robes, with their ink-stained fingers and their expressionless faces, were making decisions that would echo across continents and centuries. And they made these decisions based not on ideology or loyalty, but on calculations of risk and return that were as cold as the stone floors on which they stood. The genius of the asiento system was that it made the Genoese indispensable without making them visible. The Spanish soldiers fighting in Flanders had no idea they were being paid with Genoese credit. They saw only Spanish gold, received from Spanish paymasters, authorized by Spanish commanders. The Spanish public, proud of their empire's glory, had no conception that the silver extracted from American mines at such tremendous cost in indigenous lives often never touched Spanish hands. It flowed directly from Seville to Genoa, or more precisely, it was recorded as flowing, the actual metal remaining in place, while the accounting entries that represented it moved through the Genoese credit networks, settling debts, financing new loans, being leveraged and re-leveraged until a single real ducat in a vault in Seville might support 10 ducats worth of credit circulating through the European economy. But even this system, sophisticated as it was, required a physical clearing mechanism, a place where the vast web of debts and credits could be reconciled without the impossible expense and danger of actually moving gold and silver across Europe. This need gave birth to one of the most remarkable institutions of the 16th century, the fairs of Besançon, later moved to Piacenza when Besançon became inconvenient. These were not fairs in any conventional sense. No merchants hawked goods. No craftsmen displayed their wares. Instead, 4 times a year, bankers from across Europe converged on a small city in northern Italy, rented rooms in counting houses and private homes, and spent several days engaged in what appeared, to any casual observer, as nothing more than intense conversation and the signing of many papers. What actually occurred at Piacenza was the nearest thing the 16th century possessed to modern international finance. Imagine a great clearinghouse where every significant debt in Europe could be netted against every other debt. A Spanish banker owed money to a Genoese, who owed money to a Florentine, who owed money to an Augsburg merchant house, who owed money to the Spanish banker. At Piacenza, these debts would be compared, balanced, and settled through a series of book entries that meant that the actual amount of physical gold that needed to change hands might be a tiny fraction of the nominal sums involved. If Spain owed Genoa 5 million ducats, but Genoa owed Spanish creditors 3 million, only 2 million would actually need to be transferred, and even that transfer might happen not in coin, but through further credit instruments, bills of exchange that could be converted to cash in various cities at various times, spreading the actual movement of specie across months and locations in a way that minimized risk and maximized efficiency. The atmosphere at Piacenza during a fair was unlike anything else in Europe. The city itself was transformed, its inns and lodging houses filled with men who represented more accumulated capital than the annual revenues of most kingdoms. These men dressed modestly. Ostentation would have been vulgar, would have suggested nouveau riche uncertainty rather than old money confidence. They moved through the streets without guards, without display, carrying their fortunes in their heads and in the papers they kept in locked cases. Security was provided not by soldiers, but by mutual interest. Every man present knew that violence would destroy the delicate fabric of trust upon which the entire system depended. A banker murdered at Piacenza would not merely be avenged. His murder would collapse credit networks across the continent, would freeze capital, would turn the wheels of commerce backward. So these men, many of whom represented families who had been rivals for generations, who had fought literal wars against each other in the streets of Genoa, walked together in the evening air, discussed their business in wine shops, and conducted negotiations that would determine whether kings could fight their wars or whether armies would disband for lack of pay. The actual mechanics of the clearing process were as complex as they were clever. Each banker would arrive at Piacenza with a schedule of his debts and credits, documented with meticulous precision. These schedules would be shared, compared, cross-referenced. Discrepancies would be identified and resolved. Then, over several days of intense negotiation, the bankers would agree on a settlement that minimized the actual transfer of funds while satisfying honor and obligation. The key was the exchange rate, the value at which various currencies and credit instruments would be accepted. A bill of exchange payable in Antwerp might be worth more or less than one payable in Venice, depending on current conditions in those markets. A debt payable immediately might be worth more than one payable in 6 months, unless everyone knew that the immediate debt was unlikely to actually be paid on time, in which case the deferred debt might be preferred. These calculations required an intimate knowledge of European economic and political conditions, of which merchants and monarchs could be trusted and which were likely to default, of which cities were thriving and which were declining. The Genoese dominated Piacenza with the same quiet efficiency they brought to every financial arena. While German and Florentine bankers might possess individual fortunes that rivaled Genoese houses, the Genoese operated as a collective, their various family banks coordinating their actions with a discipline that reflected their republican tradition. A Spinola and a Doria might be political enemies in Genoa itself, but at Piacenza they presented a united front, supporting each other's credit, backing each other's bills, ensuring that Genoese paper was accepted at the most favorable rates. This coordination was never formalized, never written down in any document that historians could later discover. It operated through family connections, through marriage alliances, through the shared interest of men who understood that their individual fortunes were inseparable from the collective reputation of Genoese finance. And that reputation was built on one foundation: the Genoese always paid. When Spanish kings defaulted, when German merchant houses collapsed, when even the Pope struggled to meet his obligations, Genoese bankers honored their commitments. This reliability was not born from any moral superiority or cultural dedication to honesty. It was pure calculation. The Genoese understood that their business model depended entirely on trust, on the belief that a piece of paper signed by a Genoese banker was as good as gold. Any default, Any failure to honor an obligation would destroy that trust, and with it the entire edifice of Genoese power. So they paid, even when payment was ruinously expensive, even when it meant liquidating assets at terrible losses, because the alternative was to lose everything. This discipline gave them an enormous advantage when dealing with monarchs who lacked such constraints. Philip II of Spain defaulted on his debts multiple times during his reign, 1557, 1575, 1596, and each default sent shockwaves through European finance. But these defaults were never simple repudiations. The Spanish crown was not declaring bankruptcy in any modern sense. Instead, Philip was forcing a restructuring, a conversion of short-term debts into long-term bonds at lower interest rates, secured against specific revenue streams. The actual negotiation of these restructurings took place not in any public forum, but in private meetings between royal officials and Genoese bankers, and the outcomes of these negotiations revealed the true balance of power between them. Consider the default of 1575, perhaps the most dramatic of Philip's financial crises. The war in Flanders had consumed every available ducat. The silver fleet from America had been delayed by storms. Royal revenues, already pledged multiple times over to various creditors, could not cover even a fraction of the Crown's obligations. In September of that year, Philip suspended all payments to his bankers and announced the formation of a commission to review all outstanding debts and determine what could reasonably be paid. The immediate effect was financial panic across Europe. Credit networks froze. The fairs at Piacenza descended into chaos as bankers tried to determine who was solvent and who would be dragged down by Spanish paper. German and Florentine banking houses, heavily exposed to Spanish debt, failed outright. Merchants from Antwerp to Venice found themselves unable to conduct business because the credit instruments they relied upon were suddenly worthless. But the Genoese, though they lost spectacularly on paper, did not panic. They understood something that other creditors did not. Philip needed them far more than they needed Philip. The king might suspend payments, might force a restructuring, but he could not fight his wars without Genoese credit. Spanish silver was useless if it could not be converted into payments to soldiers in Flanders. The royal bureaucracy might control vast territories, but it had no mechanism for moving money quickly across hostile terrain. So the Genoese waited, calculated, and when the Royal Commission finally summoned them to negotiate, they came not as supplicants begging for crumbs, but as partners negotiating a new arrangement. The settlement that emerged from these negotiations was, from the Spanish perspective, humiliating. The Genoese agreed to accept long-term bonds, juros, in place of their short-term loans, but the juros they received were secured against Spain's most reliable revenue sources, the silver itself, the customs duties, the taxes from Castile. Moreover, the Genoese negotiated the right to administer the collection of some of these revenues themselves, effectively placing Genoese agents inside the Spanish fiscal system, monitoring and controlling the flows of money that funded the empire. What appeared to be a restructuring in which the Genoese took losses was actually a massive expansion of Genoese power. They had transformed themselves from external creditors into internal administrators, from lenders into partners, from bankers into what amounted to shadow treasurers of the Spanish Empire. And having secured these positions, the Genoese immediately began extending new credit to Philip, because the king's needs had not diminished, and because the Genoese now had even better security for their loans than before. The cycle began again, but this time the Genoese were embedded even deeper in the machinery of Spanish power, their agents sitting in custom houses in Seville, their accountants reviewing tax receipts from Toledo, their ships carrying not just private cargo, but royal silver under contracts that gave them first claim on any profits. This was the essential irony of the Spanish Empire in the age of Philip II. The most powerful monarchy in Europe, ruling territories that spanned the globe, was effectively working for Genoese bankers. The silver extracted from American mines at catastrophic human cost flowed not primarily to Spain, but through Spain, with the Genoese taking their percentage at every stage. The customs duties collected from the profitable Netherlands trade, the taxes levied on Castilian peasants, the revenues from Naples and Sicily, all of these passed through Genoese hands or were pledged to Genoese creditors. Spanish soldiers fought and died to expand and defend an empire whose profits enriched Genoa. Spanish administrators worked to collect taxes that paid Genoese interest. The Spanish king sat on his throne in the Escorial, that vast stone monastery palace that Philip built as a monument to Spanish power and Catholic piety, and signed documents that transferred the wealth of empires to men he had never met, who lived in a city he had never visited, who owed him no allegiance except that created by the cold logic of debt. The counting houses of Genoa understood this better than anyone. The senior partners of the great families, the Grimaldi, the Spinola, the Doria, sat in their offices reviewing reports from agents across Europe and understood that they had achieved something unprecedented in the history of power. They had found a way to extract the wealth of empires without the expense of conquest, without the burden of administration, without the moral complications of direct rule. They were parasites, in the clinical rather than pejorative sense, organisms that had achieved a perfect adaptation to their host, taking nourishment without killing, extracting value without destroying the source. The Spanish Empire could continue to expand, continue to fight its wars, continue to display its magnificence, and at every stage the Genoese would take their share, accumulating in their vaults and in their ledgers a fortune that dwarfed the hoarded treasures of any monarch. The physical reality of this wealth was carefully hidden. The great Genoese palazzos, magnificent as they were, displayed nothing like the ostentatious luxury of royal courts. There were no crown jewels on display, no galleries of golden plates, no treasure rooms where courtiers might gasp at piled coins. Instead, the wealth was in papers, in ledgers, in bills of exchange locked in fireproof vaults, in account entries that represented claims on revenue streams across Europe and beyond. A Genoese banker might live in a palace built of the finest marble, filled with paintings by the masters, but his true wealth was invisible, existed only as numbers in books, as promises and obligations, as the intricate web of debts that bound monarchs to their servants. And this invisibility was itself a form of power. Spanish peasants who paid taxes to fund wars they did not understand might riot against royal tax collectors, might curse the king for his demands, but they had no conception of the Genoese bankers who were the ultimate beneficiaries of their labor. Spanish nobles who chafed at royal authority, who resented the king's power over their privileges, had no idea that the king himself was servant to a higher power, one that operated not through commands and royal decrees, but through the silent authority of the ledger. The Genoese had achieved what every wielder of power dreams of. They had made themselves necessary, indispensable, effectively irreplaceable, while remaining almost invisible to those they controlled. By the 1580s, at the height of Philip II's power and the height of his financial dependence on Genoa, the relationship had achieved a terrible perfection. New asientos were negotiated constantly, sometimes several in a single year, each one transferring future Spanish revenue into present Genoese capital. The fairs at Piacenza cleared ever larger sums, the paper instruments traded there representing obligations that stretched decades into the future. The Genoese agents embedded in Spanish ports and custom houses sent their reports back to their masters, detailed accountings of every ship that arrived, every cargo that was unloaded, every ducat that passed through official hands. The Spanish Empire had become, in effect, a vast machine for the enrichment of Genoa, and everyone involved understood this, except perhaps the Spanish themselves. The tragedy, if one can call it that, if one can apply moral language to what was essentially a mechanism beyond morality, was that this arrangement was unsustainable. The percentages the Genoese extracted, multiplied across thousands of transactions over decades, represented a drain on Spanish resources that no empire, however vast, could permanently support. The silver from America, spectacular as it was not infinite. The productivity of Castilian peasants, however heavily taxed, had limits. The patience of Spanish nobles and bureaucrats, however well trained in obedience, would eventually break when they realized that they were working to enrich foreign bankers rather than their own king. But in the 1580s, these future problems were not yet visible. The machine still worked, the silver still flowed, the credit still supported Spanish armies from the Netherlands to the Mediterranean, and in the counting houses of Genoa, the partners of the great banking families reviewed their accounts and calculated their returns, and understood that they had achieved what their ancestors, who had been pirates and mercenaries, could never have imagined. They had conquered an empire without drawing a sword, ruled continents without wearing a crown, and accumulated power that would outlast any dynasty, because it was built not on force, but on necessity, not on glory, but on the cold mathematics of debt. The intelligence arrived on a Thursday morning in March, carried by a courier who had ridden 6 horses to exhaustion across the mountains from Barcelona. The message, encoded in a cipher known only to senior partners of the Spinola Bank, reported that wheat harvests in Andalusia had failed for the 2nd consecutive year, that grain prices in Seville had risen by 40% in 2 weeks, and that the Spanish crown, already committed to feeding its armies in Flanders, would need to purchase grain from Sicily at whatever cost the market demanded. The clerk who decoded the message in a windowless room in the Spinola Palazzo made 3 copies in his meticulous hand. One went to the senior partner, who read it without expression and locked it in his personal vault. The second went to the family's agent in Palermo, with instructions to begin quietly purchasing grain futures before the Spanish buying mission arrived and drove prices higher. The third went, through channels so discreet that no record of the transmission survived, to the Doria family, because the Doria controlled most of the shipping between Sicily and Spain, and it was understood that such information was more valuable when shared among Genoese houses than when hoarded individually. By the time Spanish officials in Madrid understood the full scope of the grain crisis and dispatched their purchasing agents to Sicily, the price had already moved. Genoese speculators, operating on information that was weeks ahead of official knowledge, had positioned themselves to profit from every bushel the Spanish crown would be forced to buy. More importantly, the Genoese banks that would be approached for yet another emergency loan to fund these purchases knew exactly how desperate the situation was, knew precisely how much the crown could afford to pay, and could set their terms accordingly. The Spanish negotiators, sitting across tables from Genoese bankers in somber counting houses, had no idea they were dealing with men who understood their position better than they understood it themselves. The asymmetry of information was total, and it was this asymmetry, more than any amount of capital or any number of ships, that made Genoese power unchallengeable. Information flowed into Genoa the way rivers flow toward the sea, drawn by gravity and necessity. Every Genoese merchant ship that sailed was also an intelligence-gathering vessel, its captain instructed to observe and report on everything he saw, which ports were prosperous and which declining, which local authorities could be bribed and which were incorruptible, what goods were scarce and what plentiful, what rumors circulated in distant markets about wars and alliances and harvests and plagues. These reports arrived in Genoa in a steady stream, sometimes by official courier, sometimes by faster unofficial channels, a message sewn into the lining of a sea captain's coat, a verbal report delivered by a trusted agent who had memorized its contents and burned the original. The great families maintained correspondence in every significant port, from Antwerp to Alexandria, men who were ostensibly merchants or ship chandlers or notaries, but who spent much of their time simply observing, listening, compiling information that would be valuable to bankers making decisions about where to extend credit and where to demand payment. This network had evolved over centuries. The Genoese had been traders in the eastern Mediterranean since the Crusades, had established colonies along the Black Sea coast, had sent explorers to chart the Atlantic islands. In every place they touched, they left behind not just trade goods, but human connections, families intermarried with local populations, Genoese who had gone native but retained their ties to the mother city, agents whose loyalty was secured through profit-sharing arrangements that gave them a personal stake in the success of Genoese enterprises. These men knew things that no amount of official diplomacy could discover. They knew when a local potentate was in financial difficulty, when a harvest had been damaged by weather, when a plague was beginning to spread, when a war was being planned, and they reported this knowledge back to Genoa, where it was collected, analyzed, and transformed into financial strategy. The analytical sophistication with which this information was processed was remarkable for its era. In the palazzo of a major banking family, one might find rooms dedicated entirely to what we would now call economic intelligence. Walls covered with maps showing trade routes, shipping lanes, the locations of mines and agricultural regions, tables piled with correspondence from agents across Europe and the Mediterranean. Clerks whose sole job was to maintain price records, tracking the cost of wheat in Danzig, of pepper in Lisbon, of copper in Augsburg, of mercury in Almaden, looking for patterns, for anomalies, for the small variations that might signal larger changes to come. These were the world's first financial analysts, though they would not have recognized the term. They understood their work as a form of augury, reading the signs of economic conditions, the way ancient priests read the flight of birds, divining the future not through supernatural means, but through the careful observation of material reality. What they learned through this observation gave Genoese bankers an almost supernatural ability to anticipate events. When plague broke out in a Mediterranean port, Genoese bankers knew about it before official authorities issued any proclamation, and they understood what the plague would mean for trade patterns, for credit availability, for the solvency of merchants who had goods trapped in quarantined warehouses. When a bad harvest struck a grain-producing region, Genoese agents reported it immediately, and Genoese speculators could position themselves in advance of the price movements that would inevitably follow. When the Ottoman Sultan began assembling a fleet for a major campaign, Genoese observers in Constantinople noted the increased activity in the shipyards, the requisitioning of supplies, the movements of troops, and this information reached Genoa long before Venice's famous intelligence services confirmed it, giving Genoese bankers time to adjust their positions, to call in loans from merchants whose ships would be threatened by Ottoman naval action, to extend credit to Spanish officials who would be funding the counter-campaign. This informational advantage was worth more than ships or soldiers. A banker who knew about a coming crisis, even a few weeks before his competitors could make or preserve a fortune, through decisions that seemed, to outsiders, almost clairvoyant. And the Genoese were extraordinarily disciplined about protecting their informational advantage. The intelligence networks they had built were closely guarded secrets. Agents did not know the identities of other agents. Codes changed frequently. Information was shared within the Genoese banking community, but almost never outside it. When German or Florentine bankers asked their Genoese counterparts about conditions in distant markets, they received polite but uninformative answers. The Genoese understood that information, unlike gold or silver, became more valuable the less widely it was shared. But information alone, however valuable, required a mechanism to transform it into profit. This mechanism, in its most sophisticated form, was the clearing fairs at Piacenza, which by the late 16th century had evolved into something that prefigured modern financial markets by several centuries. To understand what happened at Piacenza is to understand how thoroughly the Genoese had reimagined the nature of money itself, transforming it from a physical substance into an abstraction, a set of accounting entries that could be manipulated with a sophistication that would not be matched until the 20th century. The technical beauty of the Piacenza system lay in its ability to settle enormous quantities of debt through a process of netting and discounting that required almost no movement of actual coin. Consider the mathematics involved. If Banker A owed Banker B 100,000 ducats, and Banker B owed Banker C 90,000 ducats, and Banker C owed Banker A 80,000 ducats, then the three debts could be settled with a net transfer of only 10,000 ducats from A to B, with the other obligations cancelled through mutual agreement. Multiply this logic across dozens of banks and hundreds of obligations. Add the complexity of different currencies and different due dates and different levels of credit risk, and you begin to understand what the bankers at Piacenza were actually doing. They were creating a vast clearinghouse that netted out the obligations of the entire European credit economy, reducing them to their essential core, the irreducible minimum that actually needed to be transferred. But the system went beyond simple netting. It incorporated the concept of the sconto, the discount, which allowed debts to be traded at values that reflected their actual likely collection rate. A debt owed by the Spanish crown, nominally worth 100,000 ducats but known to be unlikely to be paid in full or on time, might be accepted at the fair for 90,000 ducats in settlement of obligations. The 10,000 ducat discount represented the market's collective judgment about Spanish creditworthiness, expressed not through any official rating or public proclamation, but through the hard bargaining of bankers who knew their counterparty's true financial condition. This price discovery mechanism, operating 4 times a year at Piacenza, created what amounted to a market for sovereign debt centuries before such markets were formalized. It was, in its way, as significant an innovation as double-entry bookkeeping or the joint stock company, and it was almost entirely a Genoese creation. The atmosphere at a Piacenza fair during the actual clearing process was one of intense, barely controlled tension. Imagine a large room in a palazzo that had been rented for the purpose, filled with bankers and their senior clerks, each representing obligations that might run into millions of ducats. The air thick with tobacco smoke, the floor covered with papers, every available surface occupied by ledgers and account books. The noise of argument and calculation, men haggling over percentages, disputing the value at which a particular obligation should be accepted, demanding documentation for claims, offering their own paper in settlement of debts. And over it all, the understanding that every man in that room was engaged in a form of warfare, that behind the polite fictions and the formal courtesy, there was a ruthless competition to maximize one's own position at the expense of others. The Genoese operated in this environment with a discipline that awed their competitors. They came to the fairs with their positions carefully prepared, their objectives clearly defined, their maximum and minimum terms already calculated. They did not negotiate emotionally or impulsively. When a German banker, desperate to settle an obligation, offered terms that were too favorable, the Genoese would accept instantly, without any pretense of mercy or fairness. When a Florentine competitor tried to push for better terms than the Genoese were willing to offer, they would walk away without hesitation, knowing that their own creditworthiness was so solid that the Florentine would eventually have to accept their terms or face worse options elsewhere. This combination of perfect preparation and ruthless execution made them dominant players at every fair, and this dominance translated into concrete advantages: better settlement terms, lower effective interest rates on their own obligations, higher collection rates on debts owed to them. The technical sophistication required to operate successfully at Piacenza was extraordinary. A senior banker needed to understand not just his own positions, but those of every significant player at the fair, needed to anticipate how various settlement scenarios would affect the willingness of others to deal, needed to calculate in real time the implications of accepting one offer versus another. It was, in effect, a 4 times yearly examination in practical financial strategy, and the Genoese consistently received the highest marks. Their success was built on the same foundation that supported all their operations: superior information, rigorous analysis, and the discipline to execute their strategy without being swayed by emotion or short-term pressure. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Genoese power was the neutrality they maintained, even while operating at the heart of the great religious and political conflicts that tore Europe apart in the 16th century. This was the neutrality of the puppet master, the appearance of disengagement that concealed total involvement, the studied indifference that masked calculations of pure advantage. The Genoese banks lent to Catholic Philip II to fund his wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, but they also maintained business relationships with Protestant merchants in Antwerp and Amsterdam, because those merchants needed credit for their enterprises and were willing to pay for it. They financed Spanish campaigns against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, but Genoese merchants continued to trade with Ottoman ports, selling Christian goods to Muslim buyers, because profit recognized no religious boundaries. This neutrality was not moral indifference, though there was certainly an element of that, but rather a calculated strategy for maintaining power. The Genoese understood that the moment they committed themselves entirely to one side in the great conflicts of their age, they would become vulnerable. A banker who was known to be a partisan of Spain might find his ships seized by Spanish enemies, his agents arrested, his credit networks disrupted. But a banker who was known to deal with everyone, who could arrange credit for Catholic kings and Protestant rebels alike, who could facilitate trade across the rigid boundaries that ideology and religion imposed, such a banker became indispensable to all parties. He became the necessary neutral ground, the channel through which even bitter enemies could transact business. And this position of centrality was far more valuable than any advantage that might come from loyalty to a single patron. The moral compromises this required were substantial, though the Genoese seemed to have been untroubled by them. A Genoese banker might attend Mass daily, might endow churches and commission religious art, might present himself publicly as a faithful son of the Catholic Church, and then return to his counting house and extend credit to merchants who were supplying Protestant armies with gunpowder. The contradiction was resolved through a sharp division between public piety and private business, between the persona one presented to society and the calculations one made in the privacy of the counting house. What mattered in business was not religious alignment or political loyalty, but creditworthiness, the ability to pay, the reliability of the revenue streams that secured the debt. These were questions that could be answered through careful analysis, through the cold assessment of material facts. Religion and politics were matters of passion and ideology, but business was a matter of mathematics, and mathematics recognized no master except accuracy. This leads to perhaps the most profound way in which the Genoese transformed power in their age. They pioneered what might be called mathematical warfare, the application of quantitative analysis to the problem of accumulating and exercising power. The traditional general calculated trajectories of cannonballs, angles of approach, the logistics of supply lines. The Genoese banker calculated compound interest, expected returns, probability-weighted outcomes across multiple scenarios. Both were engaged in warfare, both sought to achieve dominance over rivals, but the banker's warfare was more sophisticated, more abstract, more powerful precisely because it was less visible. Consider the calculation of compound interest, which the Genoese understood with a sophistication that would not become common in Europe for another 2 centuries. When a Genoese banker extended a loan at 15% interest compounded annually, he was not simply adding 15% to the principal each year. He was calculating that 100 ducats lent today would become 115 ducats after 1 year, 132 ducats after 2 years, 152 ducats after 3 years, following an exponential curve that meant the debt grew faster and faster, the longer it remained unpaid. Over a decade, that original 100 ducats would become more than 400 ducats owed. Over 2 decades, more than 1,600 ducats. The mathematics was inexorable, merciless, and the Genoese understood it perfectly, while many of their borrowers did not, or understood it intellectually, but failed to grasp its true implications until the debt had grown beyond any hope of repayment. This mathematical sophistication gave the Genoese the same kind of advantage that superior metallurgy gave to armies with better cannons. A king who borrowed from Genoese bankers without fully understanding compound interest was like a general who attacked a position defended by artillery he had never seen before. The outcome was predetermined by the mathematics, and no amount of courage or determination could overcome the fundamental imbalance. The Spanish crown's serial defaults were not moral failures or even primarily political failures. They were mathematical inevitabilities, the natural result of borrowing at compound interest rates that exceeded the growth rate of the underlying economy. The Genoese knew this, could calculate it in advance, and structured their loans accordingly, always ensuring they had sufficient security to recoup their capital, even in default, always positioning themselves to benefit from the restructuring that would follow. In this sense, the banker had indeed become the new general of the 16th century, but a general who commanded forces invisible to traditional military thinking. His weapons were ledgers and contracts. His fortifications were legal claims on future revenue. His armies were the network of agents and correspondents who gathered intelligence and executed his strategy across continents. He did not win glory on battlefields, did not earn titles or official recognition for his victories, but he accumulated power more durable than anything military force could secure. The Spanish Empire, for all its armies and fleets and territories, was a machine for the enrichment of Genoa, and this was not an accident or a temporary condition, but the logical outcome of the mathematical warfare the Genoese had perfected. They had calculated the trajectories of debt the way artillerymen calculated the trajectories of cannonballs, and their calculations had hit their target with perfect accuracy. The transformation of Spain's American wealth into Genoese capital, accomplished not through conquest, but through the invisible violence of compound interest and the cold logic of the asiento. The silver stopped flowing sometime in the early 17th century. Not suddenly, not in any dramatic moment that contemporaries could point to and say, "Here, this was when everything changed." Rather, it was a gradual exhaustion, a slow bleeding out, the way a body dies not from a single wound, but from 1,000 small losses of blood that cumulatively drain the life away. The mines of Potosi continued to produce, the fleets continued to sail from Seville, the machinery of empire continued to turn, but the mathematics had become impossible. The compound interest on debts accumulated over decades of borrowing had reached levels that no amount of American silver could service. Spain had become a machine designed to transform mineral wealth into Genoese profit, and the machine had worked so efficiently, had extracted so much, that it had finally consumed the host that sustained it. Philip III, who succeeded his father in 1598, inherited an empire that existed primarily on paper, a vast territorial dominion whose actual revenues could not cover even the interest payments on accumulated debts, let alone the principal. The Spanish crown's obligations to its Genoese creditors had grown to approximately 40 million ducats by the turn of the century, a sum so enormous that the entire annual revenue of the Spanish Empire, including American silver, customs duties, and taxes from every possession from Naples to Peru, barely exceeded 30 million. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The empire was insolvent, had been insolvent for years, had been kept functioning only through the willingness of Genoese bankers to extend new credit against the promise of future revenues that would never materialize in quantities sufficient to clear the debt. The breaking point came not in any single default, but in the slow realization, spreading through the counting houses of Genoa like a chill wind, that the Spanish crown would never, could never, fully repay what it owed. The asiento system, which had functioned so profitably for half a century, began to break down as even the Genoese lost confidence in Spanish creditworthiness. New loans became more expensive, demanded more onerous terms, required more intrusive levels of Genoese oversight of Spanish revenue collection. And eventually, the Genoese began to do what intelligent creditors do when they realize their debtor is terminal. They stopped lending new money and began extracting whatever value they could from existing claims, liquidating their Spanish exposure, moving their capital elsewhere. This migration of capital was handled with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all Genoese operations. There were no dramatic announcements, no public statements of lost confidence in Spain. Instead, individual banking families simply began to shift their resources northward, following the scent of new opportunities in the rising commercial powers of Amsterdam and London. The Genoese had always understood that capital, unlike territory or population, had no loyalty except to its own increase. Money did not care about tradition or national pride or historical alliance. It flowed toward the highest returns adjusted for risk, and by the early 17th century, those returns were no longer in Spain, but in the Protestant north, in the merchant republics that were building commercial empires based not on territorial conquest, but on trade, not on silver mines, but on shipping and manufacturing and finance. Amsterdam in particular became a magnet for Genoese capital and expertise. The Dutch Republic, having thrown off Spanish rule and established itself as an independent power, was building financial institutions that consciously imitated and improved upon Genoese models. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, operated on principles that would have been immediately familiar to any partner in the Banco di San Giorgio: secure deposits, efficient clearing of international debts, careful management of credit to maximize reliability and minimize risk. Dutch merchants, many of whom had learned their trade in Antwerp before Spanish armies drove them north, understood the value of Genoese financial techniques and welcomed Genoese capital. Partnerships were formed, marriages arranged between Genoese banking families and Dutch merchant houses, and gradually the centre of European finance began to shift from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. London followed a similar trajectory. English monarchs, having watched Spain's destruction through debt with a mixture of satisfaction and horror, were initially reluctant to develop the kind of sophisticated credit markets that had ruined Philip II. But the demands of financing England's own growing empire eventually overcame this reluctance, and when England did develop its financial infrastructure in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, it did so using techniques and institutions that bore the unmistakable imprint of Genoese innovation. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was essentially an Anglo version of the Banco di San Giorgio, a private institution granted governmental powers, allowed to manage public debt, designed to transform the state's obligations into tradable securities that could be bought and sold in secondary markets. The Genoese themselves, as families, largely disappeared from the historical record during this transition. Individual family fortunes were dissipated through bad marriages, wasteful heirs, or simple bad luck. The city of Genoa itself declined into provincial obscurity, no longer the financial centre of Europe, outpaced by Amsterdam and London, and eventually by New York. But what did not disappear were the techniques, the institutions, the fundamental understanding of how power could be wielded through credit rather than through force. These survived, were refined, were adapted to new circumstances, and eventually became the foundation of the modern global financial system. The direct lineage from Genoa to Wall Street is not genealogical but conceptual. The investment banks of New York and London are not descended from Genoese banking families in any direct sense. But they operate according to principles that the Genoese pioneered: the use of leverage to multiply returns, the careful management of information asymmetries, the transformation of future revenue streams into present capital through securitization, the maintenance of apparent neutrality while exercising enormous influence over political decisions. Modern sovereign debt markets, where the bonds of nations are traded like commodities and where creditworthiness is assessed by rating agencies using sophisticated mathematical models, are direct descendants of the informal markets that operated at the fairs of Piacenza. The offshore financial centers that allow capital to move freely across borders while minimizing tax obligations and regulatory oversight are spiritual heirs to Genoa's peculiar position, a city powerful through finance but claiming no territorial ambitions, serving all parties while remaining truly loyal to none. What the Genoese invented, in essence, was the offshore mentality, the understanding that true power in the modern world belongs not to nations, but to capital itself, which can move instantaneously across borders, which recognizes no sovereign except return on investment, which can punish nations that displease it simply by withdrawing, by demanding higher interest rates, by downgrading credit ratings until the cost of borrowing becomes unbearable. This is the world we inherited, and we have elaborated it with technologies the Genoese could not have imagined. Electronic transfers that move billions in microseconds, derivative instruments of such complexity that their own creators sometimes do not understand them, algorithmic trading that removes human judgment from financial decisions, but the fundamental logic remains unchanged. The ledger, it turns out, is immortal in a way that empires are not. The Spanish Empire collapsed, its silver exhausted, its territories lost or become independent, its moment of dominance reduced to a historical curiosity. The Genoese families that financed that empire faded into obscurity, their palazzos still standing in a now provincial Italian city, their descendants scattered, their specific family fortunes long since dissipated. But the system they created, the understanding they achieved of how power could be exercised through debt, lives on, has in fact become the dominant organizing principle of global civilization. Consider the architecture of modern global power. The United States maintains military bases in dozens of countries, projects military force globally, claims a kind of informal imperial authority through its economic and cultural influence. But the United States is also the world's largest debtor nation, owing trillions to foreign creditors, particularly to China. This situation would have been immediately comprehensible to a 16th-century Genoese banker. The apparent power, military might, territorial control, cultural dominance, coexists with a financial dependency that constrains actual freedom of action. The Chinese central bank, sitting in Beijing and holding American Treasury bonds, wields a form of power over American policy that is invisible to most Americans, that operates through mechanisms too abstract for public discourse, but that is nonetheless absolutely real. The American government must constantly consider how its decisions will affect the willingness of foreign creditors to continue financing American deficits. This is the ghost of Spanish dependency haunting the modern superpower. Or consider the European sovereign debt crisis of the early 21st century, when Greece and Italy and Spain again, the irony is almost poetic, found themselves unable to finance their obligations, their bonds trading at distressed levels, their governments forced to accept austerity programs dictated by foreign creditors and international institutions. The specific mechanisms were modern: credit default swaps, bond markets, central bank intervention. But the fundamental dynamic was unchanged from the 16th century. Nations that had borrowed beyond their capacity to repay found themselves at the mercy of creditors who could demand policy changes, who could insist on budget cuts and tax increases and reforms to pension systems, who could effectively override democratic decision-making through the simple threat of withdrawing credit. The citizens of these nations, protesting in the streets against austerity measures imposed by the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, were experiencing what Spanish peasants experienced in the age of Philip II. The discovery that their government served interests invisible to them, that the taxes they paid were flowing ultimately to distant creditors, that they lived in a system whose true structure was hidden beneath layers of official rhetoric about sovereignty and democracy. The genius of this system, if we can call it genius, if we can apply a term of admiration to something so ruthless, is its invisibility. Military occupation is obvious, inspires resistance, creates martyrs and nationalist movements dedicated to expelling the occupier. But debt occupation is invisible, operates through mechanisms that seem natural and inevitable, creates no dramatic moments around which resistance can organize. When a nation cuts its education budget to service debt, when it privatizes public assets to raise cash for creditor payments, when it implements labor market reforms that benefit foreign investors at the expense of domestic workers, these decisions appear to be the result of neutral economic logic, of necessary responses to market conditions, rather than the imposition of foreign will. The occupied do not even realize they are occupied. This is power perfected, power that has transcended the crude instruments of earlier ages, and achieved a form so subtle that it has become nearly invisible even to those it controls. The Genoese understood this 5 centuries ago, sitting in their counting houses in a city of marble and salt air, calculating interest and exchange rates while empires rose and fell around them. They understood that the future belonged not to the conquerors, but to the accountants, not to the generals, but to the bankers, not to those who commanded armies, but to those who financed them. They understood that debt was a more powerful weapon than any sword, more durable than any fortress, more insidious than any poison, because debt worked with time rather than against it, growing stronger the longer it existed, compounding its power through the mathematics that governed it. And they understood, perhaps most profoundly, that the lender must remain invisible to be truly powerful. The Spanish king sat on his throne and received the petitions of his subjects and issued proclamations and made war and peace, and in all of this he appeared to be exercising power, to be making decisions that shaped the world. But in the counting houses of Genoa, men in black robes knew better. They knew that the king made no decision that was not constrained by his debts, took no action that did not require their approval in the form of extended credit, fought no war that they did not finance. The king was powerful, but they were more powerful, and their power was more durable precisely because it was less visible, because it operated through mechanisms that the king's subjects did not understand and therefore could not resist. This is the manuscript written in gold that has been handed down across the centuries, copied and adapted and elaborated, but never fundamentally changed. Power flows from the ledger, not from the throne. The empire might be Spanish or British or American. The currency might be ducats or pounds or dollars. The mechanisms might be asientos or consols or treasury bonds, but the essential relationship remains constant. Those who control credit control everything else, because everything else in a monetized economy requires financing. Armies require pay, ships require construction funds, governments require operating capital, and all of these must ultimately come from those who have accumulated savings and are willing to lend them out at interest. We live now in a world that is in some ways more Genoese than the Genoese themselves could have imagined. Capital moves globally with a speed and freedom that would astound 16th-century bankers. Financial instruments have proliferated into forms of such abstraction that they sometimes seem to have lost any connection to underlying reality. Markets operate 24 hours a day across all time zones, never sleeping, constantly pricing and repricing every asset, every currency, every sovereign bond. And yet beneath all this modern complexity, the fundamental logic remains unchanged. Debt is power, creditors control debtors, and the empire, whatever we choose to call it, ultimately serves invisible masters whose authority derives not from any democratic mandate or traditional legitimacy, but from the simple fact that they have capital and others need it. The ghosts of credit walk among us still. They wear different clothes now, speak different languages, use computers instead of quill pens, but they are engaged in the same essential project that the Genoese began 5 centuries ago. The accumulation of power through the patient, systematic extension of credit, the transformation of present capital into future wealth through the alchemy of compound interest, the exercise of control through mechanisms so abstract that most people never realize they are being controlled at all. When a developing nation accepts loans from international financial institutions and then finds itself required to implement structural adjustment programs that benefit foreign investors, the ghost of Genoa is present in that negotiation, whispering the same logic that 16th-century bankers whispered to Spanish officials. You need money now, we have money now, and the price of solving your present crisis is your future autonomy. When a corporation issues bonds to finance an acquisition and then finds itself restructuring its entire business to meet debt service requirements, the ghost of Genoa is present in that boardroom, applying the same mathematics that reduced the Spanish Empire to a tributary of Italian finance. when a household takes on a mortgage it cannot quite afford and then spends decades working to service that debt, sacrificing other goals and possibilities to meet the monthly payment. The ghost of Genoa is present in that kitchen table conversation, demonstrating that the logic of debt operates at every scale, from the global to the domestic, and that everywhere it operates, it transfers power from debtor to creditor, from those who need to those who have. The final irony is this: we have become so accustomed to living in the world the Genoese built that we can no longer imagine any alternative. The idea that economic life might be organized on some basis other than debt and compound interest strikes us as utopian or naive, a fantasy disconnected from economic reality. We accept as natural and inevitable a system in which most people spend most of their lives working to service obligations to creditors they will never meet, in which nations subordinate their policy decisions to the reactions of bond markets, in which the possibility of accessing credit is considered more important than the freedom that comes from not being in debt. We have internalized the logic of the counting house so thoroughly that we can no longer see it as logic at all. It has become simply reality, the way things are and must be. But it was not always this way, and the history of Genoese finance reveals that it need not remain this way. The system was created by human beings pursuing their own interests, was refined through centuries of experimentation and adaptation, and could presumably be changed by human beings who decided that different arrangements better served their purposes. The power of debt is real, but it is not natural or inevitable or eternal. It is a human creation, as contingent and historical as any other form of social organization. Yet to change it would require first seeing it, recognizing the invisible architecture that shapes our choices and constrains our possibilities. And that recognition is precisely what the system is designed to prevent. The ghosts of Genoa do their work most effectively when we do not believe in ghosts at all, when we mistake the ledger for reality itself, rather than recognizing it as one possible way of organizing human relationships among many. Until we learn to see the chains of debt that bind us, we will remain bound, modern subjects of an empire that has no center, no capital, no flag, but that exercises power more totally than any territorial empire ever could. The empire of invisible debt, the kingdom of the ledger, the republic of compound interest that the Genoese founded in the shadows of the 16th century, and that we have inherited without ever quite realizing that inheritance came with obligations we never consciously agreed to accept. The empire was Spanish, the credit was Genoese, and 5 centuries later, power still follows invisible debt, compounding silently in the darkness, patient and inexorable as mathematics itself.